Leilani, Stacy, immigrants rights attorney at the ACLU of Hawaiʻi, and I'm also really grateful that my executive director, Summer Risby, is here this morning as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leilani. Thank you for jumping right in, and thanks for all sorts of state. And I'm particularly proud and happy to be in this community today with librarians. Thank you all for the work that you do on behalf of our communities as librarians. As you know, librarians trusted are loud because they're steady and they are quiet. They are principled. They are safe. At learn a new language, where a parent finds answers, where students find answers to their questions, where students can explore, where they can grow. Libraries are places where people can you all are stewards of knowledge, and that knowledge is powerful. Books hold more than a memory. They hold that culture. The marginalized, the challenge, the silence, and defeated in different moments of history. So no matter how controversial a subject is, particularly in this time of growing authoritarianism, we want to make sure that libraries continue to be a safe space for that true and the facts, no matter whether that's about trans identity or the genocide against Palestinians. We want to make sure that libraries can continue to operate and serve in such a way without fear. And throughout our fear, whenever fear arises, throughout our history, whenever fear arises, access to knowledge is often the first thing threatened, as we see through the Banned Books Project. We have seen efforts to remove the books, to restrict ideas, to monitor readers, to intimidate institutions. And we're seeing this happen not only in the space of the library, but now online and screening sort of what's happening virtually. But the professional ethics of the librarianship are clear. Intellectual freedom is not conditional. Access to information does not depend on whether a topic is popular, comfortable, or controversial. Libraries, we hope, will continue to be safe spaces in the state of Hawaii. Is not a technical cornerstone of freedom. People must be able to seek information without the fear of being watched or targeted. In moments when enforcement actions or public controversy create anxiety in our community, the role of the librarian becomes even more vital. Librarians, you model calm, you uphold policy, you protect confidentiality, you ensure that your doors remain open and that access to knowledge remains intact. You're not alone in the work. The law recognizes the important protections for people who use them. Policies, training, and preparation, though, do matter, which is why we're gathering here today. So does solidarity across institutions and across communities, and affirming that libraries are places of learning, not intimidation. At the heart of all the simple truth, democracy depends on an informed people. If we are going to change democracy, we need to up the knowledge that our citizens have in order to ensure that their civic engagement is more robust. We depend on these free ideas and this access to free ideas in order for us to continue to grow as a society. So thank you, librarians, for all you do, for continuing to steward that sacred trust with integrity, courage, and care. And I'm so honored to be in space today with our amazing immigrant rights attorney, Leilani Stacy, as well as our Director of Community Engagement, Sergio El Kabilia, as they have been trying to empower our communities with this public education, these Know Your Rights workshops, so that despite what is happening federally, despite what you're feeling in the ethos, you do have rights, and we want to make sure that you're protected here in this state. Thank you so much for your time. And without further ado, Leilani, mahalo.
Mahalo, Selma, and mahalo to all of you again for being here with us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Can I just get some thumbs up if you all are seeing that? I see a hand, but hopefully that's a thumbs up. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you. Well, welcome again. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit on Know Your Rights, immigration enforcement at state libraries. And just a little bit of background about me. I grew up on Hawaiʻi Island, and I remember very fondly going to the public library in Waimea growing up. So mahalo again for all that you do. It, helps little girls dream big. And I think that journey has just informed so much, and it starts young. So we want to make sure that you all understand. Generally, today I'll be going through Know Your Rights, about just general information that you might want to take home as an individual, just as a community member and leader in these spaces. And then also I'll go over specific questions and scenarios about what might happen if immigration enforcement shows up at libraries, what you might expect as a staff member, how to keep patrons safe. I'd like information more generally with the public at your libraries, because that's one of the best ways to keep our community safe during this time. Just a little bit of background before we get started on the ACLU of Hawaiʻi. In case you're not familiar, we are the American Civil Liberties Union of Hawaiʻi. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan civil rights and civil liberties watchdog. So through blue and red administrations, we're fighting litigation, community engagement, and policy work to keep our rights safe and make sure that those rights enshrined in our state and federal constitutions are upheld. So you might see us in the news filing different court cases, and you might see us at the legislature lobbying as well. And so it's kind of a holistic approach to ensuring just that everyone is able to live freely, and especially that the marginalized voices of our community are protected in a way that private organizations aren't always able to take on. So today, again, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over a little bit of context, just why are we even having this Know Your Rights training? I'm sure many of you see different incidents happening on the continent, on social media, through news feeds, etc. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context about what's happening here on the ground in Hawaiʻi. Second, I'll go over just generally, how do we think about protecting and invoking our constitutional rights when we're interacting with ICE agents? So this might be just in public spaces when you're walking down the street. And these are just general principles to keep in mind that become even more relevant when ICE agents show up at libraries. So third, I'll speak specifically about those scenarios and preemptively address any questions you might have. And then I'll go over some resources and questions and answer. As a lawyer, I have to give this very fun disclaimer. Not legal advice. And what I mean by that is if you have particular questions about your or loved one's immigration status, or even if you have more specific questions about what you should be doing at your local library, or maybe how general counsel for the libraries might think about how you should interact in these situations, please be reaching out to them directly. What I'll do today is just talk about the general rights that we have as people living in the United States, and how to stand on those rights during these times. That said, I also want to add the very disheartening caveat that in today's day and age, we can't guarantee that under this administration, we'll see immigration enforcement agents following the law. We've seen blatant violations and really violent acts, the killing of citizens and non-citizens in broad daylight on our continent. And we've also just seen really violent arrests and unconstitutional entry into private spaces. That's something that should be alarming and is very real. So I don't want to skate over or ignore that fact. But I think part of the best way we can be part of the resistance and also just continue to support our democracy is to be educated about our rights, continue to stand on them, and really learn how we can think through how we would interact in these situations to stay safe, keep our community safe, and proactively think about how we can work to protect immigrants' rights going forward. So what's happening right now? As I mentioned, historically, immigration enforcement has been focused in prior administrations on certain individuals, perhaps who have a violent criminal history, or who, just folks going through the immigration process lawfully, who might be ordered removed by an immigration judge because they weren't able to show that they are entitled to asylum or some sort of immigration relief. So that's historically what we've seen. Still pretty large numbers of deportations under red and blue administrations. But I think what is definitely distinct under this administration and since January of 2025 is just the escalation of public administrative arrests and arrests of people who have no criminal history at all, and just really targeting people based on how they look, based on how they speak, based on where they're working. That's really unusual, and it's very different in these days and times. We've also seen a revocation of the sensitive location rules. So typically immigration enforcement didn't happen at sensitive locations in our community. So think of hospitals, churches, or faith centers, and also schools. But we know that today ICE is showing up to a variety of these locations, including courts and just places where people typically gather just out of joy or out of necessity, going to see the doctor, etc. And so because ICE is now allowed to show up in these sensitive locations, it's definitely increased fear and kept people from seeking the services they need, gathering in community, because there's just so much fear about being picked up or violently assaulted in some of these situations. So with that context, here in Hawaii, we've also seen the same trends that are parallel to what's happening on the continent. While we might not be seeing hundreds and thousands of arrests like in California or other places, here in Hawaii, we have seen a huge increase. So whereas a normal year would have about 52 arrests, in the past year, there were nearly 200 arrests. And on any given day, more and more people are being locked up, even while they're going through the lawful immigration process. So for those of you who aren't aware, people who are being detained, so taken by ICE, arrested, and then locked up, they're being brought to the Honolulu Federal Detention Center, which is right near the Honolulu airport, and is a building that's typically used to house folks who are accused of a federal crime. And so again, most of all of these folks are being accused of a civil crime, but then being locked up and not able to continue to work, continue to make money and support their families because they're being detained. And so it's really just put a strain on family members, community members. Recently, we filed a case on behalf of a Hawaii Island worker who was going through the process of getting his green card and was arrested at a green card interview, locked up for more than 5 months, and was just recently released from detention. So I hope that gives you a better picture just of what we're working with here in our islands, and also what will continue to happen likely in the next 3 years. So that was kind of heavy. I've also been talking a little bit, so I'm just going to encourage everyone on the call to take a deep breath in and out. And I would say that's also the first step in any interaction that we might have with immigration or law enforcement. Take a breath. That will help you to orient yourself, maybe think back to this presentation, draw whatever morsels you recall, but just ground yourself first before interacting with law enforcement. We're seeing situations escalate really quickly. And so what you're doing right now is preparation, taking a breath and also having the knowledge and an action plan ready for these kinds of interactions is going to help you act in a way that's going to keep yourself and your patrons safe in these sorts of situations. So let's get started. Let's talk about our rights. In the Constitution, we have a bunch of different rights. I'm going to go over a few. And what's important to remember is that we all have rights, regardless of citizenship status. So it doesn't matter if you're an immigrant, a non-immigrant, a citizen, we all have the same rights under the Constitution. So this applies inside the US, regardless of immigration status, It might look slightly different when you're in removal proceedings. So that means you're before an immigration judge, or when you're at the border entering or exiting. So thinking about if you've ever crossed the border, coming back from an airport, or crossing at a different location, when you're going through those ports of entry, your rights are a little bit different, but we're not going to get too much into that. We're just going to focus here on what immigration enforcement might look like. For some context, we kind of call it alphabet soup. In the context of immigration enforcement, there's a lot of different acronyms you might be seeing thrown around. So I'm just going to point out a few and help you identify who under the Department of Homeland Security might be doing some immigration enforcement work. So DHS is a pretty large branch under the executive branch. They're a pretty large department that was created not too long ago in the early 2000s, I believe, sort of in the wake of 9/11. So pretty recent, and their scope encompasses several different areas of immigration enforcement. So like we just talked about, there's U.S. border control, which works typically along coastal and land borders of the United States. On the far left, we have the Transportation Security Administration, which we all know, TSA, going through airports. They're also under this department. And then in the middle, Custom and Border Protection. So again, enforcing immigration and custom laws at or near the border, often a little bit more focused on looking out for drugs, other sorts of illegal activity right at the border. On this page, we have a little bit more context about people that we might see showing up in our community. So under DHS, there's a few different enforcement arms and a few different parts of immigration enforcement. So you might see people wearing vests that have these different labels on them. And any of these you should be thinking about, like, these are the people who might show up. So ICE is the most common. We've heard Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're typically involved with investigating, arresting, detaining, and deporting non-citizens. Enforcement and removal operations, similarly, is involved in removing undocumented aliens ordered removed from the US. And Homeland Security and Investigations is typically a little bit more focused on criminal situations, whether that be money laundering, national security, terrorism, etc. But today we kind of see a mix of these kinds of agents just showing up for enforcement operations. There used to be a little bit more division and separation, but right now it kind of seems like an all hands on deck situation. So if you see ICE, HSI, ERO, any of those could be folks who are going to be involved in some sort of either targeted operation, maybe looking for one certain individual, or perhaps involved in a larger raid or a bigger operation. Something that I'll note is currently there are not a lot of regulations about how these officers identify themselves or even what kind of regalia they're wearing. So we're used to our state law enforcement officers, you know, having their name, clearly wearing something like a police uniform. That's not always the case with immigration enforcement officers. We've seen them wearing masks, not wearing any sort of name identification, not necessarily even having a badge or a vest identifying that they are federal law enforcement at all. So they might be wearing just plain clothes. And so as I'll go into a little bit more in a few minutes, I think what's really important is whenever you're having that initial interaction with someone who stops you and is asking about immigration status, or even who walks into a library and starts to ask people questions, is just asking for their identification first. Who are you? What agency are you with? Because the answer might differ. Maybe it's a state law enforcement officer showing up to act on their typical duties. But if it's a federal law enforcement agent, then you'll already be thinking the situation is a little bit different. Let me recall what our steps and procedures are. So now we're going to start to get into some of those rights. I don't know if any of you have seen or maybe have these available at your library, but we have these nice little red cards, and they tell you and just remind you of what your rights are so that you can pull it out in this kind of situation. And I would highly recommend that maybe you get copies of these. You can put them out for patrons to take. It's a really good cheat sheet if you forget everything I said today. And if, in this moment, there's some panic, maybe you forget everything that I said. Okay, I'm seeing a comment that we already have them in the libraries. That makes me so excited. So all of this will seem like a breeze, but I'm just going to go through a little bit more concretely what these rights mean, how they might look, and you can practice just sort of saying them along with me, and sort of thinking through like what would you do in different situations. So the first one that I'll talk about is our Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. We see this in movies all the time, but in this case, the right to remain silent applies even if you're not on a witness stand in a courtroom. It applies when you're just walking down the street and someone random who's wearing a neck gaiter walks up to you and says, "Hey, who are you? Where were you born?" You can stop right there first, ask them for identification, and then second, say, "I want to use my right to not answer questions," or "I exercise my right to remain silent. I'm not going to answer any of your questions that you have for me." So, if someone walks up and assuming this agent has no other documentation that says they have a reason to speak with you or a reason to arrest you, and they start asking questions like, "Were you born here? Are you a citizen?" At that point, you have the right to remain silent and not answer questions about your immigration status, where you were born, etc. At the same time, we always encourage folks and would like to remind you that the right to remain silent doesn't give you the right or opportunity to lie or to show false documents. So that's something that's really important. We wouldn't want you to get in trouble by sort of openly defying or providing false information. The second is that the right to remain silent does not give folks the right or ability to run or resist arrest if there is probable cause for that arrest. But the right to remain silent is really important because if someone just walks up to you, they might not know anything about your immigration status. But if in the course of answering questions, you say something like, "Oh, I was born in a different country," and they ask, "Oh, are you authorized to work here? Or did you have anything authorizing you to be in the country?" and you say no, that might give them probable cause to arrest you. The one exception that I want to give as well is that if you're driving in Hawaii and you're pulled over, you are required to provide your driver's license, insurance, and vehicle registration to an officer. So let's do a little bit of practice. We can utilize the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute, think about what ID documents you have on you right now. And then think about what document could ICE use to try to deport someone. A is a US driver's license. B is our library card. C, ID from another country. Or D, a staff ID. So maybe your staff library ID. Take a moment, think about it. Feel free to drop in the chat which one it is that you think ICE could use to try to deport someone or to gain probable cause to arrest them. Great. I think I'm seeing some consensus in the chat. Should have known librarians would be on it. Yeah. So the correct answer as I framed it is C, an ID from another country, a passport or consular ID, just because that provides some information that might indicate that someone is not from here or doesn't have lawful status. I should remind folks too that if you do have lawful status, if you have a green card or you have some sort of work authorization, you should be carrying that on you at all times. And at this stage, we often recommend that folks carry a copy, just because you should carry that actual identification on you. But if you are a citizen and you want to carry a copy of your passport, I would recommend carrying a copy of that rather than the actual document, just because of the way that law enforcement officers are being quite violent and you just don't know where that document might end up. And so what's important about a driver's license, a library card, or a staff ID is that there's no form of indication where you are from, what your immigration status might be. I see comments in the chat, and it's not untrue that at this point we see arrests and detainments happening with really no glance at any form of ID. So that is a really real consequence just of the administration and the really aggressive enforcement tactics that are happening. But just this is a creative way to think about like what documents could you encourage folks to carry around that wouldn't give someone under normal circumstances probable cause to arrest you. So again, we kind of just went over things and documents that don't include information about immigration status, and then some information about those that could be used. So those that could be used against you include a non-US passport, consular ID, a fake ID. Again, we don't want any false documents being provided, or someone else's ID. And non-citizens should carry around some proof of residency for the past 2 years, just in case there is any sort of arrest, to avoid expedited removal. Or again, if you have proof of lawful status, you should be carrying that around with you at all times. So the next right that we'll go to is under the Fourth Amendment, and that's our right to be free from unreasonable seizures. We have the right to be free from basically anyone stopping us on the street and taking us over to the side and detaining us, right? So a seizure is a stop or an arrest, and an arrest or detention requires probable cause. So that's a reason to believe there's a violation of immigration law. So someone can't just come up and arrest you on the spot without any probable cause. Again, we're seeing this happen pretty widespreadly on the continent. I would say less so that we've been seeing this here yet. And so typically ICE will try to get probable cause during an interaction by asking questions or getting consent to a search. And that's why the documents that you're carrying around you, the way you invoke your right to remain silent, are so important. We also have the right to be free from unreasonable searches. So that means that typically there's no entering private spaces without a warrant or consent, no searching a car or belongings without a warrant, consent, or arrest, no searching your person without a warrant, consent, or arrest. So again, just a reminder, you don't have to consent to a search. And this is helpful to think about just with typical law enforcement interactions as well. And there are a few exceptions for emergency and safety, but in general, we should think about the basic principle being, unless there's probable cause or there's some sort of warrant, there's no reason that we should be detained or searched by a law enforcement official. So I'm going to transition now to talk a little bit about, we're starting to move into what would happen in a library or a private space or a public space. And so under the Fourth Amendment, we have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, particularly in private spaces. The Fourth Amendment requires that law enforcement officials have a judicial warrant to enter any private space. Think about our homes, right? Those are places that belong to us and are really private, that we don't allow just members of the public to come traipsing into. Sure, we might invite some people into our homes on occasion, but typically if someone just shows up at your door, they're not allowed to enter. And the same goes with federal law enforcement agents. So that's the way to think about, like, where can an ICE officer go and where can they not go? The key question to keep in mind is, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in this space? So is it somewhere that typically the public wouldn't be allowed to go? Or is it somewhere that, yeah, people are going in and out of here all the time? And that line and that distinction can be blurry, can be tough sometimes, but it's also the line along which we draw the need for a judicial warrant. So again, just thinking briefly, maybe take a moment to think, or if you're already in your office or you're at maybe a circulation desk, just think about your own workspace and think about, are there break rooms? Are there places where it's clearly marked that the public can't enter? Those are private spaces, and those would require some sort of judicial warrant for ICE officers to enter. In contrast, you can also think about your library and maybe the surrounding areas. Think about what's public, open to the public, because libraries are open to the public. That's the greatest benefit, right? So where are places that anyone's allowed to go? Anyone's allowed to enter. Anyone might show up to. So typically those might be lobby, just kind of the stacks, parking lots. And those are places where library staff wouldn't typically be able to stop ICE from asking questions or making arrests because those are public spaces. And so anyone, including ICE officers, can enter those spaces. So if ICE comes in, we're going to start to transition to think about what would happen, right? What should we do? What should we be looking for? So if ICE shows up and they say, I'm looking for this staff member. Are they on break? Are they somewhere here that I can come get you? And you know that person is in a back office. You know, they're typically holed up there eating their lunch. And so they're in a space that's not public. Then in order for ICE agents to enter that back office and arrest that person, they would need a judicial warrant. So we're going to go over what the difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant is. So if ICE shows up and says, I want to enter this backspace, I want to go to this office, I want to go to this break room, you should ask, do you have a judicial warrant? And then you're going to check to make sure it's actually a judicial warrant. So a judicial warrant is issued by a court. It's signed by a judge, not an immigration judge. It states the address or names the person. So it'll probably state the address of your library, name the person they're looking for, and it'll list a particular time frame. So you just want to do your due diligence, make sure it's the right date and time and not from 5-10 years ago. In contrast, you might have heard of administrative warrants or ICE warrants. And those warrants only give ICE the ability to stop someone on the street and arrest them then and there based on just them being in public and because there is an arrest out for an immigration violation. But it doesn't give them the power to enter private spaces. So it doesn't give them the ability to enter a home, enter a back office, etc. So that would be issued by DHS, which is the Department of Homeland Security, as we went over at the beginning. You would look for that kind of seal. That would be signed by an immigration officer or an immigration judge. And for anyone who wants to nerd out with me for a little bit, the reason these two kinds of warrants are different is we think of our three branches of a government, and a judicial warrant is under the judicial branch. And so we give our courts certain powers. And one of the powers that a court can do is issue a search warrant. But immigration judges, immigration officers fall under the executive branch. So at the top would be President Trump, and that's the executive branch. And immigration courts and judges fall under that branch. And typically, there's been no authority given to those sorts of officers to issue search warrants. So again, the authority to issue an arrest warrant is really only under immigration law. Those folks haven't necessarily violated any sort of criminal law, and that's why there's no judicial warrant to allow people to enter private spaces. So again, we'll share these slides out, and I know that this is being recorded, so don't feel like you need to rush to note down all these, spot the differences. But I will say it's helpful if you want to just Google judicial versus immigration warrant. You can take a screenshot, have it on your phone, and be prepared in case something happens. You'll remember the key things to look for. So on the left-hand side, we have an example of a judicial warrant. At the top, you'll see that there's the United States District Court. And here in Hawaii, that's the District Court for the District of Hawaii. You'll look to make sure the right address is listed. It's the correct address for your library. You'll make sure the date and time frame is still current. And note that only the person, property, and area specified may be searched. So just because ICE agents might have a judicial warrant to find one person in one office, that warrant doesn't then give them the opportunity to open someone else's office door, or to now go into the break room, or to look for other people in private spaces. It's very specific that a court will issue a warrant for a particular person, place, and time. And then you want to make sure it's actually signed by the judge. On the right-hand side, we see just sort of the immigration warrant, which just gives ICE officers the ability to arrest people who are typically already subject to an order of removal or deportation, more colloquially. And some visual cues that it's an immigration warrant are that it's signed just by an immigration officer or an immigration judge, but not a district judge. And there'll be some language probably about immigration as well. So subject to removal or deportation from the United States, whereas a judicial warrant is much more generalized. So just to review, if ICE shows up at libraries, they can enter public without a judicial warrant. So if they walk into a lobby and start to ask patrons about, their citizenship status, etc., that's where all those principles that around the right to remain silent, around what documents you're carrying, those are the kind of things that would kick in. But typically, there's not as much authority to stop ICE from doing anything in those areas. Of course, libraries are quiet spaces, so if it starts to be disruptive, I imagine you all might have some authority to ask them to leave. But just strictly speaking, under the law, they're allowed to walk in because anyone can enter a public library. Places where they can't access without a judicial warrant are non-public areas of the library. So again, think of staff areas, anywhere that would require some sort of registration. And I would really advise you to check with your leadership about just sort of who's in charge. So generally, employees or staff members are not required to grant access, provide documents, or assist federal immigration officers in entering non-public areas. So what I mean by that is, just because I'm Stacy, I see you've raised your hand. Would you like to intervene?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind really quickly.
Yeah, please do.
Remember we do have a standard policy of contacting our offices directly if you're in that situation, and then we contact the AG immediately. So just if you experience this, just call my offices right away and we'll follow up with AG. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. So typically, you can say something politely to an ICE officer, say, hey, I don't have any warrant, but I just want to go back there. You can say, you know what, I'm actually not authorized to give you access to non-public spaces of the library. And at that point, you call Stacy and then it's run up the chain. But just to the extent that you can have, calm interaction with them, just explain the limits of your authority. I think that's totally normal. It's something we practice and sort of advise to have that action plan in place. Interacting with ICE. So again, just because agents are allowed to be in a public part of the library doesn't necessarily give them the authority to arrest someone on the spot without probable cause or consent. So again, if that individual is choosing to remain silent and then ICE, starts to detain them, that would typically be unlawful. It doesn't mean it won't happen. And so if you're standing there observing, something we can always encourage folks to do as, just helpful bystanders is to remind folks, hey, you have the right to remain silent. You can ask to talk to an attorney first. And we would just encourage, staff shouldn't interfere with law enforcement activities just because we don't want to see any sort of escalation. And also there could be potential consequences for obstructing any sort of federal investigation or just federal law enforcement activities. But something we do encourage is documenting the agent's activities. So if the agents say, I have a warrant, maybe asking, can I see it? Can I take a picture of it? And then again, you can run through judicial versus administrative, or just starting to document the interaction really publicly has been so helpful in this day and age of just information sharing and being able to see with our plain eyes. And something we always say as lawyers, unfortunately, is we can't always prevent a violation of civil rights from happening, but documentation and just witnessing that can be so important to getting to having some sort of action possible after the fact to enforce those rights after the fact. So on that note, again, we would just encourage if ICE comes, taking a photo of any document ICE agents show you, that can be helpful to pass along to the AG's office or to Stacy eventually. Openly record the interaction. Do not resist. Keep yourself and your community members safe. And after ICE agents leave, if there's any damage, it would be really important to document that as well and write down exactly what happened. If you asked for or recall the agent's name, what they looked like, what they were wearing, what enforcement agency they were from. I see a few hands and questions. I am going to get to answer those probably in the next 5 minutes or so. So you can write it down in the chat if you'd like, scribble it down so you don't forget. But I am mindful of those and we'll have time and space to address them shortly. Again, before any visit, just making sure that you've designated the person responsible for handling law enforcement requests. So as you know, running it up the chain of command is helpful, but you might want to think just internally amongst staff members. If you're all comfortable doing that, that's great. But maybe if there's a preference at a particular branch for a director or the supervisor, manager on duty to be that point person, maybe it's someone who has a really great public speaking voice. That can be just something that you talk through beforehand. And I know that there are often library volunteers as well. So it's helpful to think about whether this training might be useful for them and just, helping them to be a part of that action plan. During a visit, we've gone over asking for the officer's identification, referring the officer to the library's designated person, notifying Stacy, etc. And if that designated person isn't present, again, just recording the information and a written report describing the inquiry to any library director. Just briefly, we've talked about search warrants today. Those are judicial warrants. So those may be executed immediately. So you might not have time. It's probably not possible for the AG to be present when that starts to happen, right? Like that could be a spur of the moment thing. But you just want to go through, check to the extent you're able to, just see if the judicial warrant is compliant with all of those things we talked about. Probably ask several members of your staff to look it over and just be present when that search happens. And make sure that if there's a search warrant for particular items or if they're looking not for a person, but for like certain records or documents, that you're making sure they're only taking the things that are specified in the warrant and not agreeing to any additional searches or just volunteering information up generally. A subpoena is something that's a little bit different. It would be a sort of a request for records. And that would be something that takes a little bit more time. So typically not executed on the spot. That's something you would just like direct to Stacy in the AG's office immediately, and they would probably take it from there. So I'll just conclude. Thank you all so much for following along. I'll just conclude with some other resources and ways to support immigrants during this time. I know you all are doing so much already to share information with our communities, and I appreciate that so much. And so a few different resources that I really love, in addition to the red cards, are these We Have Rights videos. They're put together by some different organizations, and they kind of walk through what I've just done, but in a much more fun, animated way of what our rights are if ICE shows up in our doors, on our streets, etc. I think they're really cute and well done. There are some local response groups and just nonprofit organizations here in Hawaii that I really recommend just following on social media, being involved with. On Maui, it's Roots Reborn. Here in Oahu, there's the Legal Clinic. They provide just general nonprofit legal services to folks who are seeking status. And there's also some rapid response groups to ICE sightings on Maui through Roots Reborn, here on Oahu through the Oahu Rapid Response Coalition. And I know on Hawaii Island as well, Aloha Latinos are super active in just responding to different community events and really being just present bystanders who can provide community support during any sort of interaction. If you're curious where I got all of this information from, it's from the American Library Association. They provided guidance just on what to do if ICE shows up at libraries. So feel free to go check out that page yourself, and you'll see where I got all the information for today's presentation. One final call to action that I would just, encourage as individual members of our state is that the Hawaii State Legislature is open and it's all happening right now. There's a bunch of bills that are being promoted and pushed. And the ACLU of Hawaii and the Hawaii Coalition for Immigrants' Rights are really trying to encourage several bills in part of a campaign for immigrant justice package forward at the legislature that would just help ensure that we keep our sensitive locations safe, that we have no secret police so that ICE agents are identifying themselves and not wearing masks in these interactions, as well as just some issues that affect us all. If we have keiki in our family, there's a student safety bill that would encourage the Department of Education to have a standardized action plan for ICE enforcement, etc. So if you're interested, feel free to sign up for our mailing list or follow the Hawaii Coalition for Immigrants' Rights on social media, etc. Finally, I'll just leave this up for a minute so that folks can see. But if you or a loved one, someone is detained, this is the deportation defense hotline here in Hawaii specifically. So this number is one that we encourage folks to memorize that we just encourage folks to memorize or just have handy so that you could report someone being detained right away.